You are listening to Setting History Straight with Linda Watson.
And welcome to our show. And tonight I'm going to do a program on Parthia. This week in New York City, they put up the Arch of Triumph, and that arch commemorates Rome's victories over the Parthians. So I think it's only fitting that we know who the Parthians are, and I'm going to go over that information with you tonight. I think it's unbelievable that we allow an archway to go up commemorating Rome's victories over Parthia when we are the descendants of the Parthians. We are the descendants of the Parthians. Now, most of the research I'm going to cover on this program comes from a book called The Lost Tribes of Israel Found by Stephen Collins. Some of you are very familiar with him. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a guest with us, Josh Fink. Josh, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing just fine, Linda.
Thank you so much for joining us. Now, Josh is from Fort Walton.
Yes, ma'am. Fort Walton Beach, Florida, on the Panhandle.
And we're broadcasting out of New Orleans. So, Josh, we're going to start by talking about the Parthians tonight. We're going to start by giving the audience a brief little summary of the history of Parthia. Around 550 BC, the Scythians and the Parthians were beginning to come to power in basically Eastern Europe. And the Parthians were really the people we call the Scythians. They became such a large group that they just pushed their way into Asia Minor, into Central Asia, and into almost to the edge of India. And that whole area, Asia Minor area and Central Asia, was basically the territory for Parthia. And it really began to start coming to power around 550 BC. Before that time, I don't know if you remember Darius that's mentioned in the Bible.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. His name tends to pop up here and there.
Right. He wrote on the Histian stone, which is a very famous stone in Iran, all his conquest, and he mentioned the people called the Sacae, which were the Scythians. He called them Sacae, and so he listed all these people that he had gone into war with. And it's interesting, that's our first information that we see in history about the Scythians. And like I said, the Scythians became so large, they just kind of pushed their way into that area. Now, around the 3rd and 4th century, Alexander went in and took that entire area. And the Greek Empire was formed, and it formed basically 4 large regions after Alexander died. And one of the areas that Parthia was in was the Seleucid Empire. And eventually, Parthia broke away from the Seleucid Empire and gained her own independence from the Seleucids. And that happened around 250 BC. Parthia gained her independence. Now, her first king was Artaxerxes, which is interesting because Xerxes, again, is another name for the Sacae people. Now, Strabo was a famous historian and geographer back in 5th century. He talks about Artaxerxes and said that he was a Scythian man, and he basically lived around the Caspian Sea area. And he mentioned that he was basically a Bactrian, which we're going to talk about that particular group. And Justin, who was another historian, also mentioned Artaxerxes and said he was a Scythian. So we know that these people were Scythians. And we know that the Scythians came into Europe, and they basically were the Israelite tribes that settled in the area of Scythia. Now, we also know that the Messiah, when he was on the earth, made mention of who the Israelites were. And he told in Matthew 10, he said, don't go to the Gentile nations, go to the lost tribes of the house of Israel. And Josephus tells us that they were just across the Euphrates River. Well, across the Euphrates River was Parthia. So we know that the disciples, it's well established that the disciples went into Scythia, they went into Parthia, they went into different parts of Europe and Gaul, and they actually also went into Britain and Scotland. Now, around 640 BC, Parthians had control of the Asia Minor area, and they were an equivalent rival with Rome. Now, Parthia went to war with Rome 13 times, and Rome was never able to defeat Parthia. Now, what basically happened is that Parthia had landlocked the Romans, and the Romans were trying to expand their territory eastward. Well, they ran up against Parthia. Parthia at that time was as large, if not larger, than the Roman Empire, and more powerful. So you had Scythia in Eastern Europe at the top. Rome couldn't expand there. You had Parthia in Central Asia, and they couldn't expand there. So basically, they were landlocked. And then around 143 BC, we had the fall of Carthage. When Carthage fell, those people began to push their way into Parthia also. So you had these huge amounts of people moving into that area around 143 BC, and we saw that influx of people come in there. So that's just a brief little history. I just wanted to take a minute and tell people the early history of Parthia. And we now want to talk, Josh, about why do we believe that these people were the Israelites?
Well, and we do know that, with the scattering and with the belief systems that we hear when we read back, and we see a lot of the similarities between what we know now and what just how similar in a lot of areas that they were.
Well, exactly. They are very similar, and that's the information that we want to cover tonight and show people that absolutely we know who these people were. It is very obvious when Josephus says the lost tribes of Israel are across the Euphrates River. Well, the Euphrates River was the territory for Parthia. So it becomes very obvious who these people were. And if the Messiah knew where they were when he was on earth, and the disciples knew where they were during the first century, then obviously they were not lost, as some people want to say. They were lost. They were scattered among the different nations. They were not. They did go to different areas of the world. They're scattered in New Zealand and South Africa and into Australia, into South America. They pushed themselves out to the edges of the earth, which the scripture says that they would do. But they were not scattered, as people want to say, and mixed in with the Gentile nations. They did not do that. They were separate nations of their own. And so that's going to be a very important point, because many people don't understand that. They just think they were lost in history, and they went in and they mixed with all the Gentiles, and now they are all Gentiles. This is not what history teaches us. So one of the reasons that this information has been left out, Josh, is because they don't want us to know that our descendants were Abraham's seed. People that are historians do not want us to know that.
And that goes hand in hand with why they even want to keep us from reading the Old Testament and learning what our heritage really is.
Exactly. And this is validating the Bible and the history in the Bible. So what we're doing is, as we go through these programs, we're teaching people that the stories in the Bible are accurate, and you can find them in history. That's the entire purpose of this program, is to show people that you no longer have to believe the stories in the Bible on faith. You can believe them because they're written in history and they're written in archaeology. So, I mean, I think that's a critical piece for people to know. Now, around the 1800s, there was a man named George Rawlinson who he wrote the history of the Parthians. He's been given the credit. I think it's a 6-volume series that he wrote. And he saw at that time that the historians were beginning to leave out the countries that we call the Israelite nations. They wrote about Babylon, which was a pagan nation. They wrote about Rome. They wrote about Greece. They wrote about the Persians. And many of those were pagan nations. But they completely left the history of Europe out. It's been completely left out. So it's very interesting that people do not understand this, because how would they possibly know who they are and know that their ancestor was Abraham and know that they are in covenant with Yahweh? They're in covenant to keep those Old Testament laws, but they don't know that because they don't have any clue that they are the descendants of the Israelites. Now, throughout history, that information was lost, and now we are trying to bring that forward again. And if you go out on the internet, you see tons and tons of information out there that people are writing and writing and writing about the people who we know as the Israelites and that the 12 tribes. There's many, many people writing about this now. So it's becoming information that people are becoming aware of. So I tell you what, Josh, we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about Parthia and some of the proofs and characteristics of the Parthian people. Now, Rawlinson wrote this 6-volume series, but he quoted many of the historians that lived during that time. And one was Justinian, one was Cassius, Strabo, which we mentioned, Finney, Herodian, all of them wrote about the Parthians. And so these people were not a small nation. We know all about Rome, but we don't know about Parthia, which was the other superpower in the world at that time. It's like people writing history now and writing about America, but not even mentioning Russia, if that makes any sense. So, I mean, that's basically what's going on here. Now, the first thing that we want to mention is they were Scythians. And one of the things Rawlinson says is they were kinsmen to the Scythians. He wrote, the manner of the Parthians had, they tell us, much, their language was half Scythian and half Median. They armed themselves in the Scythian fashion. They were, in fact, Scythians in descent, in habits, and in character. So now that's a quote from Rawlinson. He's basically saying they were Scythians. Now, Rawlinson also explained, and Diodorus also, said they were a people who had been dominated by another foreign nation. They were exiled from their homeland. Now, isn't that interesting that they were exiled from their homeland?
Sounds familiar.
Doesn't this sound familiar? You begin to see all the characteristics that they're listing here of the Parthians tie in exactly with the Israelites, because the Israelites were an exiled people. Now, their language was Aramaic. Now, the Aramaic language originated in Syria and in Palestine region. Now, I'm going to read you what the Encyclopedia Britannica says about the Aramaic language. It says, the alphabet in use in Persia, at least from the time of the Arsaces dynasty onward, was based on the Aramaic. The early records of the Aramaic language go back to about 800 BC and were found in northern Syria, and other development of Aramaic was modern Hebrew. So Rawlinson wrote about their language, and he said anybody who knew Hebrew could read the language of these people, and because they said it was so similar to the language that they knew. He said any Hebrew scholar could pick up their writings and read it because it had so much Hebrew in it and Hebrew words. Now, there was a group of people in Parthia called the Iranianites. Now, that's where the land of Iran gets its name. It takes its name from the Iranianites, and that was a clan in Parthia. Now, the teachers today, the historians today, try to make the people in that area into the Persians or into Oriental. And we know that that's not going to be the case, and we're going to prove that as we go a little further down. Now, Josh, can you read for us Numbers 26:35?
26:35, and I will be reading from the New King James Version. And these are the sons of Ephraim according to their families. Shaluthah, the family of the Shaluthites. of Becher, the family of the Bechrites; of Tahan, the family of the Tahanites.
Okay, and then verse 36.
And these are the sons of Shuthelah, of Iran, the family of the Iranites.
Okay, so that's where we get the name Iran, but you notice that the Iranites are mentioned here in Numbers 26, and it's also the same people, same tribe of people that were in Parthia. So, and then you also mentioned, Josh, the Bechrites, and the Bechrites was another group that was in Parthia, and they lived in the province of Bactria. It was the name of it, Bactria. They lived in the old province of Bactria, and they called them the Bechrites. So now you have at least two tribes of Ephraim that are living in Parthia. So that's one proof right there that these people were the Israelites. They spoke the Aramaic language, which is basically many Hebrew words that came out of Palestine and Syria area. They were the kinsmen of the Scythians. Some of the tribes there were actually mentioned in the Bible as the tribes of Ephraim. So you're beginning to see all these proofs that these people were of the tribes of Israel. Now we're going to go on and we're going to prove it a little further here. Now, the cities in Parthia had Hebrew names. So, Josh, how does that happen?
Well, they would have to have Hebrews there that actually established these cities.
Exactly, and we've already talked about at least two tribes that we know of in Parthia that were tribes that were mentioned in the Bible as sons of Ephraim. Now, some of these cities, we're going to mention some of the city names. Many of the cities had Hebrew names. One of the cities was Zara. Josh, can you read 1 Chronicles 2:6 for me?
Yes, ma'am. The sons of Zara were Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, and Dara, 5 of them in all.
Okay, these were the sons of Zara. Now, one of those sons that is mentioned there is Dara. And here we have a major city in Parthia with the same name, Dara. Now, another city was called Asac, named after Isaac. Asac, almost identical to the Saxay people that we mentioned that were called the Scythians. Now, their chief city, their largest city in Parthia, was named Gaza. Does that ring a bell? It certainly does. I mean, many of their towns were named Israelite names. They took the same names that they had in the old cities, in the old country, and brought them into this new country. Now, in the southeastern province, there was a city named Samaria. And that's just too many coincidences for it to not be recognizable that these people were the Israelites. Now, they are mentioned as Ephraim in Numbers 26, 35, and 36. They were the sons of Ephraim. We talked about that. That is obvious proof that they were the Israelites. And this goes to the core of who these people were. Now, to make it even more dynamic and more, the Parthians had the tribe of Judah as their kings. So they used the tribe of Judah as their kings. And you remember that there was two sons. Tamar had two sons. Zara was one, and the other one was Phares. And Phares was the line that King David came from. King David and all the Israelite kings that lived in the land of Israel and Judah basically came out of that lineage. They came out of the Phares line. And the Zara line was the Trajan kings, which we've covered in another program. Each one of the kings in Parthia used the name Phares in their name. And I'm going to show you this. The first king I'm going to talk about is Godorpheus, and he has Phar in his name. The next one is Pharesites, P-H-A-R-A-S-I-T-E-S, and then Pharetus, P-H-A-R-O-R-T-E-S, and Pharetisius, and Pharamanes. I'm not going to spell all of them. But every one of the kings had the name Pharaoh in their name. And that is because they came from the lineage of Phares. They included that in their title and in their name because they came from the line of Phares. Now, go ahead and read for us, Josh, 1 Chronicles 2, verse 4
Verse
and
4.
5.
Yes, ma'am. In verse 4, it says, And Tamar, his daughter-in-law, bore him Perez and Zara. All the sons of Judah were 5. The sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamul.
Okay, so this is that Phares line that we're talking about here. Now, many of the kings were named with the same name, P-H-A-R. You see that name? You see it in Scripture, P-H-A-R-E-Z. That is the name that we're talking about here. It was carried through the entire line of all the kings of Parthia. Every one of them had P-H-A-R in their name. So how does that happen, Josh? And
It's
them not
passed
be
down.
Israelites. It's
Well,
impossible.
it's impossible. It would have to come through. We know that all through the Bible, as we read, we know there is an importance to them remembering their heritage and their lineage. And that's the names. What better way to remember your heritage than to pass names down the line?
Exactly. Now, another interesting fact is that they have the coins from Parthia, and they have a Caucasian face on the coins. And so if they're an Oriental race or they are Persian, then they would have a Persian appearance on the actual coins. But the face, it appears to be European stock. It has no Oriental features in the coins that they have. So it's just really mind-boggling. Now, we know that the Scythians were of European stock, and one of the ways that we know that is that there is actual pictures of the Scythians in the museums in Russia. There's a museum, a Russian museum in St. Petersburg that has pictures of the Scythians. Now, they also found this vase. It's called the Kubal vase, which shows Scythians that were of European origin, not Oriental origin. It's also interesting, Josh, that the Scythians and the Parthians are mentioned in the Bible. They're mentioned in the New Testament. Can you read for us 1 Peter, I think it's chapter 5, verse 13.
Yes, ma'am. 1 Peter 5, verse 13. She who is in Babylon, elect together with you, greets you, and so does Mark, my son.
Okay, so Babylon was in the territory of Parthia. So they're talking about a church that was really a church in Parthia called Babylon, in the city of Babylon. And it says that they were salute them. So here's an example here of the people in Parthia being part of that New Testament church. People skate over that, but they really don't really see it and understand it. They were mentioned in the New Testament. Now, Babylon was in the Parthian Empire at the time of the 1st century when the New Testament was composed. So they were talking directly to the Parthians. Now, there was a historian called Eusebius that noted that the Apostle Thomas was assigned to Parthia as the minister. So we know that the disciple Thomas went to Parthia. Now, Eusebius lived during the time of Constantine, so that wasn't that far off from that time frame. Now, Andrew is mentioned as being assigned to Scythia. And believe it or not, Peter was assigned to Britain. There's an article that you can actually read on the internet. It's called Where Did the Disciples Go? It's written by Dr. Herman Hay, if you want to see the proof. Now, so if they're told to go to the tribes of Israel, the lost sheep of Israel is what the Messiah said in Matthew 10. He said, I want you to go to the lost tribes of Israel. Well, if they went to Britain, and if they went to Scythia, and if they went to Parthia, what does that tell you? That was where the Israelites were. Now, there's another scripture. We're going to start, I think it's Acts chapter 2, verse 1. Can you read, starting in verse 1?
And then skip to 8 and 9, I believe.
Okay, yes, thank you.
You're welcome. And in chapter 2, verse 1, when the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in peace. And verse 8, and how is it that we hear each in our own language in which we were born? Parthians and Medes and Elamites, those dwelling in Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia.
Okay, great. And so it's telling you that the Parthians were actually there on the day of Pentecost. So why would they be there?
Because they were worshiping with their brothers.
They absolutely were worshiping with their brothers. And so that's why they were there. And so were the Medes, some of the people that were the Medes. We're going to get into, eventually we're going to get into the origins of the people. And we're going to talk about who the Medes were in history. Then we're going to talk about who they are today. We're going to talk about the Elamites and find out who they are today. Elam was actually a lot of the Slavic people in Eastern Europe is the tribe of Elam. They were called the Sarmatians. And they lived in the area of Scythia, very near the Israelites. And so they were a Semitic people that were actually one of the sons of Shem. Now, I want to make sure that everybody knows this quote here from Josephus. It says, the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates River till now. Now, he wrote in the 1st century, and are an immense multitude and not to be estimated by numbers. So what he's saying is that they were across the Euphrates River, and they were a huge amount of people. So, Josh, how in the world does the historians leave these people out? They go to war 13 times with Rome.
It's propaganda. And if you do away with history, it's basically propaganda that you have spread so the things that you're teaching will be known as history instead of what the truth really is.
Exactly. That's exactly the case. Now, I want to get into something very interesting here, and that is the miracles that happen in Parthia. We mentioned that Parthia was this huge superpower. And they lived and were the greatest rival to Rome. And Rome was landlocked. Rome could never expand because of Parthia. Parthia was in the way for their expansion. Now, the other people that were in their way was Carthage. The Punic Wars brought the Carthaginians down. We would actually have more history now if Rome had not gone in and destroyed Carthage. Carthage had this huge library. It was probably one of the world's largest libraries, and Rome burned it to the ground. So we would probably have more history now than we have. Of course, God has his ways of doing things and why he allows certain things to happen. But the Romans looked at Carthage and looked at Parthia as their greatest enemies. So we're going to talk about, I call it the miracles of Parthia. And as we go through these, it's just unbelievable, the history. Now, the first is the Battle of Hearty. And it says the Parthians sent Cranius, which was the emperor of Rome. They sent him a message saying that they would take pity on such an old, aged emperor. They knew that this would upset him. He was outraged. And he went to battle with Parthia. Rome was defeated. Half of the Roman army was killed. 1/4 was taken captive, and another quarter fled. Now, Crassus's head was filled with gold and taken to the king of Armenia. Now, remember, Armenia was the other part of the Israelite communities. I mean, it was another nation that was an Israelite nation, and they were known as the Cimmerians. They didn't write it as Samaria. They spelled it with a C, Cimmerians, but they were called the Cimmerians. How did they get a name like that? We keep going over these proofs, and it's unbelievable that people don't see this information. So that first battle, Parthians kind of tricked Crassus into a battle with him. And now The next battle was in 40 BC, and Parthians attacked Rome. And this war was fought to protect the area of Armenia. Again, that was another Israelite country or tribe. The campaign was so successful that they took Syria and Palestine, and the Parthians actually set up their own king, Antigonus. Now, Antigonus was the ruler of Palestine, and he only ruled there for 3 years until King Herod replaced him. But at one point, the area of Palestine, or what we call the land of Israel, was ruled by Parthia. And they had put a Parthian king. Most people don't know that. There was a Parthian king ruling the land of Israel, and that was 40 BC. So, I mean, this is very interesting. Now, then what basically happened is the famous Mark Antony came into Egypt and then went into the land of Israel and pushed Parthians back across the Euphrates River. And that was around 37 BC. Now, we're getting very close to the time of the Messiah. And from the time of 370 BC until 58 AD, there was peace in the land of Israel. There was no battles. There was no war in the Middle East. It was like God stopped all the battles and the wars that was going on between Rome and the Parthians so that there would be a time of peace during the time of the Messiah. Now, I just think that's interesting that time frame, Josh, that there's absolutely no wars or battles going on. I mean, I just think that's interesting.
It is. I mean, especially as hostile as the area, mainly Israel, has always been. That it has virtually always had some type of skirmish, if not an all-out war in that region.
You know, and it's just interesting that Parthia was so powerful that she actually went in and took the land of Israel.
And you have two powers, it's like two superpowers. I mean, it's almost like maybe they were in a Cold War. Look at, you mentioned us and Russia earlier.
Right.
You know, and we have had that in our own history. And it's, as we all know, history has repeated itself over and over again. Well, you never have just one power.
Exactly. And so the interesting thing about this was that they didn't allow King Herod to stay on the throne. They took him off the throne when they came in. And they put in the last of that Pharaoh's line. The person who actually ruled for Parthia in the land of Israel was one of the last descendants of that Pharaoh's line, which I think is just amazing because if you remember the story, Herod was an Edomite. So he actually did not have authority in the land of Israel, but he was given that authority by the Romans.
And was it not Herod that he had actually married a princess, which actually later gave him that title where he could be a king?
Exactly. That was Mary Ann. He married Mary Ann, which was one of the sisters of the last Pharaoh's line. She was one of the last remaining. And believe me, they were trying to kill off all of those descendants. So it's a very interesting story. We will go through that entire history at some point. I do have that on my website. If you go out to 12 Tribe History, you can hear the history of that time period. I think it's called the Maccabees is what I have it listed as. Now, in 62 AD, Nero, everybody's heard of Nero, he went into Parthia and tried to take Armenia. And, of course, he lost that battle. And the battle that I want to tell you the most about that I think is the most interesting is the battle with Trajan. Now, Trajan was the emperor of Rome, and he never took a hint, apparently, because Parthia was trying their hardest to actually, at that point, try to make peace with the Romans. And so they sent an ambassador to Rome, and Trajan killed him. And I can't tell you how that enraged the Parthians. But they did not act in a way of revenge. They basically wanted peace with the Romans. Now, Trajan was actually living and wintering in Antioch, and he was preparing for battle against the Parthians. And God sent this severe earthquake that destroyed Antioch and 9 other Roman cities. And this should have been a divine warning to Trajan to take heed and not march against the Parthia, but it didn't. He went through the area of the Persian Gulf and he burned down many of the cities. It looked for a while there that he was actually winning and that he was actually going to take Parthia. And that was the closest anyone in the Roman Empire ever came to taking down Parthia, because these were incredible war powers. These were mighty warriors. Now, once he got into the area of Parthia and he had burned down the cities, some very interesting things happened. There was another earthquake. There was a plague of flies. There was a hailstorm, and there was thunderstorms. It got so severe that he had to turn around and march back through the same territory he had just conquered. Now, Josh, what does that sound like to you?
It sounds like there was some
Earthquake?
divine intervention, and he was not supposed to go where he was going.
Exactly. Well, he had a warning, but he didn't heed the warning. And then when he got there, there was another earthquake, a plague of flies, a hailstorm. It almost sounds like the plagues that came on the Egyptians. Almost sounds exactly like that. It got so bad that he actually fled. Well, he was actually winning at that point. He was actually taking Parthia at that point, but God did not allow it. God did not allow it, and that's all these supernatural events happened. Now, I know people could look at that and say, well, it's a coincidence that it happened, but how can you explain anything like this, Josh? I mean, how...
You can't, and it's, people do want to say you can't have that many events happen in a short period of time that happen the way they do without it being supernatural or divine intervention. I mean, it just cannot be. I don't know of any example that you can look at where all these things would happen at once.
Exactly. And it's absolutely the case. And God was protecting these people in Parthia. So eventually they would fall, but not to Rome. Now, another interesting story. They made a peace treaty with Trajan, but of course Rome didn't keep that peace treaty. Now, I will tell you, in history, the Romans are descendants of Amalek. And one of the interesting things about that is that that's one of the reasons that God was so upset with Saul. If you remember the story of Saul, that he was told to go in and wipe out everything, and he didn't do it. He left the king, and he left some of the sheep, and he didn't do what God had asked him to do, and God was so angry with him that he took his kingship away from him. If you remember that story, Josh.
Yes, we do. That was the start of where David was being brought in, and I believe it is Samuel that tells Saul that his days will come to an end as the king.
Those same descendants were the people that would become the Roman Empire. In Scripture, it tells you that it's talking about the Israelites, will go to war with Amalekites every generation. That we will go to war with Rome every generation. And if you look at history, over and over and over, we had many battles with the Roman Empire. And people don't understand that Byzantine Empire, the same nations that was in the Byzantine Empire are the ones that were in World War I and World War II, the same nation.
The Axis powers.
The Axis powers came right out of the Byzantine Empire. It's amazing. Now, let's go on with this last story here. And this was the Emperor Cassius. But he has a very interesting history. Now, actually, the Parthians crossed the Euphrates into the Roman territory, and they were pushed back by Cassius, and the Romans began to burn the capitals of Parthia. Now, there was 2 capitals of Parthia, and they burned both of them. That's like burning Washington, D.C. So what happened was Rome began to win. This time, Rome is struck by a plague. The entire Roman army is affected. They retreat and they spread the plague to every town they pass through. It wipes out the entire Roman army. Every city that they went in, half of the Romans died with this plague.
with the Romans retreating, and you say they spread this through their towns. Well, we know that they didn't have cars back then. They traveled by foot. What they had to do was they used so many of these towns for their stops, for their rest places. And if they all were destroyed by plagues on their way back, then they could not go in again, because there would be no way for them to effectively bring their army back. There's no place to rest, recoup your troops and your horses.
You know, Josh, how in the world can people read this history and not recognize that there was something special about Parthia, that there was intervention for Parthia by God? It's impossible to read these accounts and not see that information. It's impossible. Now, eventually, Parthia did fall, and they fell to the Persians in around 224 AD, but not to Rome. And it's interesting that they went back up into Scythia, but it also says that the kings of Parthia went into Armenia. Why would they go to Armenia? Because that was their brother. Now, I'm going to read you a quote here from George Rawlinson. It says, the Armenian monarch who had been set on the throne was the uncle of the young prince of Parthia and was especially anxious to maintain the Artaxerxes in power. That's the name for the ruling power of Parthia. He gave them refuge in Armenia. So he gave them refuge. So here's proof here that the people that we call the Armenians were part of the Israelite community. He said that this was a young prince of Parthia who was the uncle to the king in Armenia. So you see the actual connection. These people knew who they were. Everybody at that time knew who the Israelites were. They knew where the 10 lost tribes were. The Messiah knew where they were. Josephus knew where they were. The disciples knew where they were. The people knew where they were. So it's just in our history that they've been left out. And I just think it's amazing. Now, we're going to be talking next how the tribe of Gad, which was the Goths, go into Europe. And that will be the group that God allows to take over the Roman Empire. And what people don't understand is that it was the Israelites, which were the lost tribes, came out of Scythia, went into Western Europe, and took down Rome. They fell to a tribe called the Visigoths. The Visigoths were the Goths. We're going to pick up that story, and we're going to talk about that the next time. But before I do that, I want to show you one more proof, and this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It says the main movement of Asia into Europe, which went north of the Caspians, was in early times that of the Scythians. So he's telling you in the Encyclopedia Britannica that the main movement of the people that went into Europe were the Scythians. Now I'll read that again. The main movement from Asia into Europe, which went north of the Caspians. So they came through the Caspian mountain range, and that's how they got into Scythia, were in early times of that of the Scythians. So historians know that these people that came into Western Europe that became the Germanic tribes were the Scythians. Now we're going to be picking up and talking about each one of these 12 tribes, where they went, and who they became in history. And the first one we're going to talk about is the tribe of Gad. And so what we tried to do tonight is show you the similarities between the people of Parthia and the tribes of Israel. We talked about how they spoke a language very similar to Hebrew, just like Josh just mentioned. We talked about how their cities were named after the cities in the land of Israel. We talked about all the battles that Parthia went through with Rome, and the miracles, the absolute miracles that happened. That God just intervened and saved these people over and over and over again. They were a very powerful superpower that has just been left completely out of our history. Now, Josh, I think we're just about at the end of this program. Is there any comments you would like to make before we close?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, there's one. And, throughout our teachings tonight, you've taught us about, there's such an importance in the names. Well, we read these names and we're reading them, I'm assuming in your New King James Version, you're reading it in English. Well, we know that the descendants of Israel, they had their own language, Hebrew. They did not speak English. They spoke Hebrew.
Right.
Their names were passed down because in the Hebrew language and in the Paleo Hebrew, each letter of the alphabet has an individual meaning. Now, in English, an A just is an A. It's a letter of the alphabet. But in the Hebrew, they have meanings, so they could actually pass these meanings of where they came from through their names. Absolutely. Because of the Hebrew language. And we miss a lot of that because we lose that in our English translations. And if we can, even reading in English, if we can understand that these names were originally in the Hebrew language and they had meaning. Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to know where these names came from. And if you actually can learn it in the Hebrew, you can actually learn the meaning of what that name is. Why was this city called this? But you would know why that city was named for what it was.
Exactly. Now, this week in New York City, they put up the Arch of Triumph. And that arch commemorates Rome's victories over the Parthians. They're setting up an archway that commemorates the Romans' victories over Parthia, but the people in this country don't understand that our descendants were the Parthians. So are we not commemorating Rome returning to this land again a second time with new military aspirations? Is this a gateway being put up so that Rome can enter our land and fight the Parthians, the descendants of the Parthians, one more time? So with that question, we're going to close and we're going to say blessings to all and good night.
And good night, everyone. It was a pleasure being able to speak to you tonight.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
It was my pleasure, Linda.